design, create, communicate. I want that.
Last week, we watched Gary spend an entire year trying to help Mark function better in a team environment before finally accepting that keeping Mark on the team just wasn't sustainable. Today, we'll pick up the story from there. Once Mark was gone, Gary had an opportunity he hadn't had in years. He could rebuild the team from the ground up. He could hire people who were technically strong, but also strong communicators. He could finally shape the team culture intentionally instead of inheriting dysfunction and trying to manage around it. But as Gary started that rebuilding process, something important became clear. The problems Mark caused weren't just about Mark, they were also about Gary. Mark's behavior had been obvious and disruptive. He dismissed people who thought differently, shut down conversations, and made collaboration harder than it needed to be. But Gary realized that his own leadership had played an important role also. He hadn't built an environment where diversity and diverse perspectives were truly supported. He had blind spots around the inclusion and diversity, and those blind spots had allowed some dysfunction to take root. In other words, removing Mark fixed a symptom, but it didn't automatically fix the system. If Gary wanted a new team to be different, he had to be different also.
After I let Mark go, I spent a lot of time reflecting on what went wrong. Yes, Mark's communication was terrible, but I started asking myself harder questions. Had I created an environment where only certain kinds of people felt comfortable? Had I inadvertently rewarded communication styles that excluded others? When I looked honestly at my team's demographics and at who had thrived versus who had left, I saw patterns I couldn't ignore. I needed to learn about inclusion, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because I saw how a lack of inclusion can destroy a team's performance.
This week is about what Gary learned and what he did differently as he built his new team. His experience with Mark taught him that technical competence without communication skills is insufficient. His experience rebuilding afterward taught him that communication skills without inclusion and cultural intelligence are also insufficient. Both dimensions are essential for professional effectiveness in a contemporary workplace. Gary knew from the research that diverse teams tend to deliver better performance, stronger innovation, and higher engagement. But after everything that happened with Mark, he understood that the idea in a but after but after everything that happened with Mark, he understood that idea in a different, much deeper way. It wasn't just about diverse teams performing better on an average. They perform better because different perspectives challenge assumptions, surface blind spots, and push teams toward better decisions. Mark had represented the opposite of that. He approached problems in one narrow way and dismissed anything that couldn't line up with his thinking. The team didn't struggle only because Mark was difficult to work with. They struggled because his dominance in discussion shut down other voices. When Gary looked back at the mistakes those teams had made, a pattern became clear. Many of those problems could have been avoided if different perspectives had been truly and genuinely heard and taken seriously. Gary came to another important realization. Working with diverse teams is not something students might face someday in the future. It's something that's already the reality of the Canadian workplace. His rebuilt team included people from 6 different countries. Several spoke English as a second language or a third language. There were differences in age, education, culture, and life experience. Gary understood that if he couldn't create an inclusive communication that built trust and psychological safety across those differences, the team would fail. Not because people weren't capable, but because the environment would once again prevent them from contributing fully. If the culture didn't change, the outcome would not change either. Global business connections require cultural intelligence. Gary's organization was expanding into new markets. They were working with partners in Europe, Asia, and South America. Gary needed his team to communicate effectively across cultural boundaries, which required understanding that communication norms that worked in Toronto might not work in Tokyo or Sao Paulo. After watching Mark alienate people within a single office, Gary understood how critical cultural intelligence would be for global collaboration.
One of the developers who eventually left because of Mark was an immigrant from India. She had about 15 years of experience and really deep knowledge of distributed systems. Honestly, she knew her stuff. But in meetings, Mark would talk over her, cut her off, or brush past her ideas like they were nothing. Sometimes he'd make comments about her accent, things he clearly thought were jokes, but they landed badly and made her feel like she didn't belong. After she left, I went back and actually looked closely at her technical contributions. That's when it hit me. We didn't just lose a good developer. We lost someone whose perspective could have helped us avoid several expensive architectural mistakes. Stuff that later cost us time, money, and stress. That's when I realized this wasn't just a diversity issue, it was a performance issue. And it happened because I failed to create an environment where people could communicate, contribute, and be taken seriously without having to fight for space in the room.
Gary started his inclusion work by thinking more deeply about identity and authenticity than he had before. He came to understand that identity is not just something about characteristics that you're born with, like race, ethnicity, gender, or sexuality. It also includes identities you acquire over time through education, professional experience, family roles, and life experiences. Looking back, Gary realized that he'd been thinking about diversity far too narrowly. He had focused mostly on visible differences and overlooked acquired diversity that was just as important to how people think, communicate, or contribute. That led him to think differently about authenticity. Becoming authentic means being able to bring your whole self to work, including your multiple identities. Gary had never really questioned this before. He had assumed that everyone felt free to be themselves at work, just as he did. With reflection, he recognized that this assumption revealed his own privilege. For Gary, authenticity had always felt safe because his identity aligned closely with workplace norms. He didn't have to calculate what to share, how to speak, or when to stay silent. For others on his team, authenticity came with real risks. Being themselves could mean being judged, dismissed, or excluded. Understanding that difference became a foundational step in how Gary approached inclusion moving forward. Intersectionality means understanding how multiple identities interact and shape experience. One of Gary's new hires was a woman of color who was also neurodiverse. Her experience at work was shaped not by just gender or race or neurodiversity individually, but how these identities intersected. Gary had to learn that creating inclusion required understanding these intersections rather than treating each identity dimension separately. Psychological safety enables authentic workplace presence. Gary had learned this concept during his work with Mark, but he had understood it primarily as safety to speak up about work issues. Now he understood it also meant safety to bring your authentic identity to work without fear of judgment or exclusion. Mark's behavior had destroyed both kinds of safety simultaneously, and rebuilding required intentionally creating conditions where people felt safe being themselves while also feeling safe contributing professionally.
I recently had a conversation with one of my senior developers who is part of the LGBTQI A2S plus community. I asked them if they had ever felt the need to hide parts of who they are at work. They told me that for their first 2 years here, they never mentioned their partner in casual conversations because they weren't sure how people would react. They said they would sit in meetings and listen to others talk about their spouses, weekends, and families, and they would just stay quiet. Not because they had nothing to share, but because it felt safer not to. That really stopped me because I had always thought we had created an open and welcoming environment. But in that moment, I realized we only created that environment for some people, while others were constantly filtering themselves, deciding what was safe to say and what was better left unsaid.
Gary had to confront his own biases and stereotyping patterns. Stereotypes are simplistic generalizations that limit recognition of individual qualities. Gary thought of himself not being prejudiced, but when he examined his thinking honestly, he found stereotypes operating unconsciously. When interviewing candidates, he made assumptions about communication ability based on accents. When assigning projects, he made assumptions about technical capability based on educational background. Othering involves the implicit or explicit separation into different groups. Gary recognized he created in groups and out groups on his team without conscious intent. People who were different from Gary had to work harder to get the same opportunities. This was not malicious, it was unconscious favoritism towards similarity. Gary also had to confront how unconscious bias was shaping his decisions, often without him realizing it. Bias showed up through things like the halo effect, attribution bias, and projected cognitive similarity. The halo effect meant that if someone was strong in one area, Gary tended to assume that they were strong in others as well. Attribution bias meant he explained success and failure differently depending on who was involved. When someone he related to succeeded, he credited it to skill or effort. When someone he did not relate to struggled, he was more likely to blame the person rather than the situation. Projected cognitive similarity meant Gary often assumed that people should think the way that he did, and he became frustrated or dismissive when they approached problems from a different angle. What Gary learned was that simply having biases was not the problem. Everyone has them. The problem was letting those biases operate unchecked. Recognizing them didn't make them disappear, but it did reduce their power. Awareness gave Gary a pause point. When he caught himself making a quick judgment about someone's ability, he started to ask himself whether that judgment was based on actual evidence or on assumption. When he noticed himself gravitating toward people who reminded him of himself, he made a conscious effort to slow down and seek out other viewpoints. Over time, this practice changed how decisions were made on the team. Gary didn't become bias free, but he became bias aware. And that awareness created room for fairer evaluation, better listening, and stronger decisions. It also helped to ensure that more voices were heard, especially those who had been overlooked in the past.
One of the hardest things I had to admit to myself was that I kept giving Mark chance after chance, partly because he reminded me of me earlier in my career. I'd been like that too. I'd been overly direct. I'd brushed off perspectives I didn't immediately get. I told myself I was just being efficient or focused, when really I was shutting people down. I saw a younger version of myself in Mark, and without realizing it, that made me more willing to excuse his behavior and believe he'd eventually figure it out. At the same time, I was way less patient with other team members who were actually doing better work, but who didn't look like me, sound like me, or approach problems the way I did. That realization was uncomfortable. It forced me to confront the fact that my idea of potential was biased, and that my leadership decisions were shaped more by familiarity than fairness.
Gary's new team also spanned 4 generations, which brought real opportunities, but also some clear communication challenges. The oldest group represented this was the silent generation, sometimes called traditionalists, born between 1925 and 1945. Gary had one consultant from this generation on the team. His communication style was telling right away. He was formal, direct, and very comfortable with hierarchy. He expected decisions to flow clearly from the top. The casual tone and informal messaging styles of the younger team members made him uncomfortable, and at times he read that informality as a lack of professionalism rather than a generational difference. Gary himself was a late baby boomer, born between 1946 and 1965, and this is where he had another important realization. Boomers tend to be optimistic, competitive, and strongly relationship focused. Without meaning to, Gary had shaped much of the team culture around boomer norms. He valued face to face relationship building, detailed emails that explained context, and formal meetings to talk things through. To him, that felt normal and respectful. What he had not fully recognized was that what felt natural to him didn't feel natural or efficient to everyone else. Several members of Gary's team were Gen X, born between 66 and 1980. They were highly independent, self reliant, and adaptable. These team members preferred autonomy, minimal oversight. They wanted clear goals, clear deadlines, and then space to get the work done. Gary's frequent check ins and relationship focused management style felt intrusive to them, even though his intent was supportive, where Gary saw collaboration, they saw micromanagement. What Gary began to understand was that none of these communication styles were wrong. They were simply different. Inclusive communication meant recognizing those differences and adjusting rather than assuming one generational style should define professionalism for everyone on the team. Gary also had millennials and Gen Z team members, those that were born from the late 80s onward, and their expectations added another important layer to how teams communicated. These team members were highly comfortable with technology, strongly values driven, and expected a high level of authenticity from the leadership. They wanted to understand not just what they were building, but why it mattered. Transparency around decisions was not optional to them, it was expected. They moved easily across multiple digital channels at the same time: messaging, shared documents, project tools, and video calls, often blending work and conversation in ways that felt natural to them. They were also much more willing to question decisions when those decisions felt out of step with the stated values. Early on, that pushback felt uncomfortable for Gary. He sometimes read that as resistance or lack of respect for authority. Over time, though, he began to see it differently. Their insistence on clarity, purpose, and values alignment made the team better. It forced more thoughtful decision making, clearer communication, and stronger consistency between what the organization said and what it actually did. Understanding the generational diversity helped Gary recognize something critical. Many of the communication preferences that he had assumed were universal were actually rooted in his own generational norms. Inclusive communication didn't mean asking everyone else to adapt to his boomer expectations. It meant learning to flex his approach, meeting people where they were, and creating space for different ways of communicating to coexist productively. Canada's racialized population continues expanding significantly, and Gary's team reflected this demographic reality. He had team members who were East Asian, South Asian, Black, Middle Eastern, and white. Creating inclusive communication required understanding how race and ethnicity shaped workplace experience in ways Gary, as a white man, had never had to navigate. Gender influences communication patterns, with research showing relationship oriented versus direct communication styles correlating with gender socialization. Gary noticed that women on his team often adopted collaborative and supportive communication patterns, building consensus before advocating for position. Men on his team, himself included, were more likely to advocate directly for positions without extensive relationship building first. Gary had to confront how gender norms and workplace expectations shaped communication in uneven ways. He realized that often what gets described as collaborative or supportive communication from women is not an inherent trait, but frequently a response to environments where more direct or assertive communication from women is punished. In other words, people adapt their communication to what feels safest in a given context. He began to notice clear double standards. When women on his team advocated strongly for their ideas, they were more likely to be receiving feedback suggesting that they were being aggressive or difficult. When men advocated just as forcefully, the same behavior was described as confident and decisive. This wasn't about intent or skill. It was about how identical behavior was interpreted differently depending on who expressed it. Gary had to actively name and challenge this pattern both in his own thinking and in how feedback was given across the team. He also had to adjust to evolving understandings of gender. His younger team members often had more fluid and expansive views of gender than the ones that Gary had grown up with. Inclusive communication meant not making assumptions based on names, appearance, or voice, respecting pronouns, and recognizing that gender diversity extends beyond a simple binary. This required Gary to unlearn some long held assumptions and intentionally develop new communication habits. What Gary came to understand was that inclusive communication is not about assigning traits to groups. It's about recognizing how systems, norms, and power dynamics shape how people speak, listen, and are heard, and then working deliberately to create conditions where everyone can communicate without penalty. LGBTQ2 plus professionals make up roughly 4% of our Canadian population. And like everyone else, they needed environments where they felt safe bringing their authentic selves to work. Gary had never really thought about this in a concrete way until his conversation with a gay team member made him realize how much quiet self editing had been going on. That conversation showed him that tolerance on its own was not enough. An affirming environment requires active inclusion. That meant using correct pronouns, acknowledging same sex partners naturally in team conversations, and being willing to challenge heteronormative assumptions when they showed up. LGBTQ2 plus professionals make up roughly 4% of the Canadian population. And like everyone else, they need environments where they feel safe bringing their authentic selves to work. Gary had never really thought about this in a concrete way until his conversation with a gay team member made him realize how much quiet self editing had been going on. That conversation showed him that tolerance on its own was not enough. An affirming environment requires active inclusion. That meant using correct pronouns, acknowledging same sex partners naturally in team conversations, and being willing to challenge heteronormative assumptions when they showed up. These actions were not about being political. They were about signaling that people didn't have to hide parts of who they were in order to belong. Gary also became more aware of religious and spiritual diversity and how it shaped everyday work experiences. His team included people who were Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, and secular. He learned that inclusion showed up in practical ways, accommodating prayer times, being mindful of dress and modesty norms, planning team meals that respected dietary restrictions, and recognizing religious holidays that were not part of the standard Canadian calendar all mattered. None of these adjustments were especially difficult, but they had made a real difference. What felt like a small change to Gary often determined whether someone felt genuinely included or quietly othered. Mental health challenges affect 20% of Canadians yearly. Gary realized that after the stress of the Mark situation, several team members had experienced anxiety and depression. Neurodiversity, including autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and disabilities, require inclusive design. Gary hired a developer with ADHD who was brilliant but struggled with certain aspects of team coordination. Instead of seeing this as a deficit, Gary worked with him to understand what accommodations would help him succeed. This included providing written summaries after meetings, allowing flexible work arrangements that matched his energy patterns, and assigning projects that played into his strengths in deep focus work. Gary learned that disability inclusion requires both physical and communication accommodations. Accessible design, flexible work practices, and willingness to adapt communication styles created environments where everyone could contribute to their best work. This was not special treatment. This was removing barriers that prevented talented people from demonstrating their capabilities.
We had a team celebration lunch one time, and I ordered food without even thinking about dietary restrictions. It didn't even cross my mind. When the food arrived, one team member couldn't eat anything because of religious dietary laws, and another was vegetarian for ethical reasons. They were polite about it, really gracious, said it was fine. But it wasn't fine. I felt awful. That moment stuck with me because the exclusion wasn't intentional, but it was real. My lack of attention meant a couple of people were basically sitting there watching everyone else eat. It sent a message I never meant to send. After that, I made it a rule to always check dietary needs before any team food event. Every time. It's a small thing, sure, but the small things add up. They're often the difference between people feeling genuinely included and just feeling like they're being tolerated.
Gary developed some deliberate practices to support inclusive communication on his team. The first was learning to assume positive intent while still acknowledging impact. This came directly out of the Mark experience. Mark always claimed his intent was positive. He wanted high quality work. What he never acknowledged was the impact of how he communicated. Gary made a point of teaching his team to separate intent from impact. You can mean well and still cause harm. When someone tells you that the words or actions had a negative impact, the right response is not to defend what you meant. It's to listen, acknowledge the impact, and adjust your behavior. The second practice was focusing on strengths and unique contributions across the team. Gary made this explicit in meetings. Instead of only talking about problems or what needed fixing, he regularly highlighted specific contributions people had made. He was intentional about what counted as contribution. It was not just technical problem solving. He also recognized relationship building, mentoring, knowledge sharing, process improvements, and creative thinking. Over time, this helped shift what the team valued and who felt seen. Gary also worked intentionally to create psychological safety around identity and authenticity. He stopped assuming inclusion would just happen on its own. In meetings, he modeled vulnerability by sharing parts of his own experience and talking openly about what he was still learning about inclusion. When team members shared aspects of their identities, he acknowledged the trust that it took and reinforced the authenticity was valued on the team. That made it safer for others to do the same. Finally, Gary committed to challenging stereotypes and bias through active dialogue. He made it clear that people could call out bias when they experienced it, even when it was uncomfortable. That included calling him out. When Gary caught himself making assumptions, he wanted the team to feel safe naming it. When biased language or stereotypes showed up in team conversations, he addressed them directly instead of letting them slide to avoid awkward moments. He learned that discomfort was not a sign of something that was going wrong. It was often a sign that real learning was happening. Together, these practices helped turn inclusion from an abstract value into something that the team experienced every day through how they communicated, listened, and worked together.
One thing I really learned from the whole Mark disaster was that I'd been way too focused on technical excellence as the only thing that mattered. If someone was strong technically, I gave them a lot of leeway. If they weren't the loudest or flashiest engineer in the room, I didn't always see their impact. What I missed were the people who actually made the team work. The ones who built trust, who helped others unblock problems, who quietly made sure things didn't fall apart. They weren't always the most visible, but they were essential. On my new team, I try to call out all kinds of contributions, and I do it out loud. Not just code quality or clever solutions, but collaboration, mentoring, and relationship building too. That shift has changed the culture in a real way. People don't feel like they're all competing on one narrow definition of technical ability anymore. They feel valued for different strengths, and the team is better for it.
Gary also learned to pay close attention to silence in meetings. After years of watching Mark dominate conversations, he became very sensitive to whose voices were missing. Silence, he realized, rarely meant a lack of ideas. More often, it signaled barriers to participation. He started noticing patterns. Some people only spoke when they were directly invited in. Others were regularly interrupted. Some ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them, and then suddenly they were taken seriously. Once Gary started seeing these patterns, he could not unsee them. That awareness pushed him into another realization. Organizations don't become inclusive by accident. Good intentions are not enough. Gary stopped assuming that people knew just how to communicate inclusively. He arranged formal training for his team on inclusive communication, unconscious bias, and cultural intelligence. At the same time, he committed to doing his own learning through reading, workshops, and conversations with people whose experiences were very different than his. He understood that leadership meant building these skills deliberately, not assuming that he had already had them figured out. Gary also created both formal and informal ways for people to be heard. He introduced anonymous surveys so team members could be sharing their input on decisions without the fear of being judged. This gave a voice to people who were uncomfortable speaking up in a group setting. He scheduled regular one on one meetings and made inclusion part of those conversations, asking directly whether people felt safe being themselves at work. He also set up dedicated team chat channels for questions or concerns that might feel awkward to raise in a formal meeting. Finally, Gary learned that inclusion requires follow up, not just open doors. When he noticed someone had been talked over in a meeting, he checked in with them afterward to hear what they had wanted to contribute. When someone seemed hesitant to disagree with the group, he reached out privately to understand their concerns. Over time, he realized that hearing all voices takes active effort. It doesn't just happen because a leader says everyone is welcome to speak.
I used to think that as long as you treated everyone with basic respect, you were doing inclusion right. Be polite, be professional, don't be a jerk. I thought that was enough. The whole Marx situation showed me pretty clearly that it wasn't. Treating everyone the same doesn't actually work when people are starting from different places and dealing with different barriers. I mean, what feels fair on the surface can still leave some people struggling to be heard or supported. What I've learned is that inclusion takes effort. It means paying attention, noticing who's getting space and who isn't, and stepping in when needed. It means giving people what they need to succeed, even if that looks different from person to person. That was a big shift for me, rethinking fairness not as sameness, but as equity.
At this stage in Gary's journey, inclusion began to stretch beyond his immediate team and into the global context. His organization was expanding internationally, which meant working with partners, clients, and colleagues across cultural boundaries. Gary quickly realized that everything he had learned about inclusive communication within a diverse Canadian team was necessary, but it wasn't enough on its own for cross cultural effectiveness.
About 6 months after rebuilding my team, we partnered with a development team in Japan on a major project. At that point, I thought I had this inclusion thing figured out. I'd learned some hard lessons, made real changes, and felt more confident in how I showed up as a leader. It didn't take long to realize that what I'd really learned was inclusion inside a Canadian context. Working across cultures added a whole other layer. Stuff that felt open and inclusive to my Canadian team sometimes came across as confusing or even a bit disrespectful to our Japanese partners. That was another wake-up call. I couldn't just rely on good intentions or assume my way of communicating was neutral. I had to slow down, listen more, and learn how different cultures approach hierarchy, feedback, and decision-making. Cultural intelligence turned out to be its own skill, not just an extension of diversity or inclusion, and I had to actively develop it.
Gary came to understand that concepts like psychological safety, authenticity, and voice don't look the same everywhere. What feels like an authentic self expression in Canada might be interpreted as unprofessional in another cultural setting. Even the idea of speaking up depends heavily on cultural norms around hierarchy, respect, and group harmony. The shift from building inclusive workplaces to communicating effectively across cultures was not just about abandoning what Gary had learned. It was about applying those same principles with cultural intelligence. Inclusion couldn't just mean imposing Canadian norms on global partners. Instead, it required understanding how different cultures build trust, make decisions, share disagreements, and resolve conflict. Only then could Gary communicate in ways that were genuinely inclusive rather than unintentionally exclusionary on a global stage. Gary had learned cultural intelligence, often called CQ, is the ability to work effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. This was related to, but distinct from, emotional intelligence, which had been central to addressing the problems with Mark. Emotional intelligence helps you understand and manage emotions in yourself and others. Cultural intelligence helps you recognize, interpret, and adapt to cultural differences in communication norms, values, and expectations. Gary came to understand cultural intelligence as having four core components: cognitive knowledge, metacognitive awareness, motivation, and behavioral adaptation. Cognitive knowledge involves understanding how cultures differ in communication styles, values, and business practices. Gary began reading extensively about the cultures his team interacted with. He learned about the differences in hierarchy, indirect versus direct communication, expectations around formality, and the role of relationship building in a professional context. This knowledge gave him framework for interpreting behaviors that had previously seemed confusing or inefficient. Metacognitive awareness is the ability to step back and examine your own assumptions in real time. Gary practiced noticing when he was interpreting situations through a Canadian lens and assuming those norms were universal. When cross cultural interactions felt frustrating or unclear, he trained himself to ask a different question. Instead of assuming the other person was being evasive or unprepared, he asked whether the cultural differences might explain what he was experiencing. Motivation refers to the willingness to engage with cultural difference rather than expecting others to adapt to you. Gary had to confront his assumption that English and Canadian business norms were neutral defaults. They're not. They reflected one cultural approach among many. Expecting everyone else to operate according to those norms, even unintentionally, created imbalance and exclusion. Developing cultural intelligence required genuine curiosity and a desire to adapt rather than impose. Behavioral adaptation is where knowledge and awareness turn into action. Gary learned to adjust how he communicated depending on cultural context. He changed how direct he was, how formal he sounded, how quickly he pushed for decisions, and how much time he invested in relationship building before moving to task focused work. This flexibility didn't come easily, but it proved essential for effective global communication. Over time, Gary learned that cultural intelligence rests on respect, recognition, and the appreciation of difference. It develops through curiosity, study, reflection, and intentional cross cultural experience. He continued to make mistakes, but instead of seeing those mistakes as failures, he treated them as learning moments. That mindset allowed him to grow steadily more effective at working across cultures rather than becoming defensive or discouraged. As Gary's work became more global, he had to learn to avoid several common cultural pitfalls. The first was projected cognitive similarity, the assumption that other people share your norms, values, and ways of working. Gary had already fallen into this trap with his Canadian team, assuming everyone thought about hierarchy, time, and relationships the same way he did. In cross cultural contexts, that assumption caused constant misunderstanding. What felt obvious or reasonable to Gary often rested on cultural expectations that weren't shared by his partners. Another pitfall was stereotyping individuals based on cultural generalizations. Gary spent time learning about Japanese business culture, but he had to remind himself that cultural frameworks describe tendencies, not rules. Not every person from a particular culture behaves the same way. Effective cross cultural communication required holding two ideas at once. General cultural knowledge was useful, but it had to be balanced with an openness to individual differences rather than a rigid expectation. Gary also had to confront bias around language fluency. Judging non native English speakers as less capable communicators was an easy trap to fall into, and he saw how damaging it could be. Several of his team members spoke English as a second or third language. They were articulate, persuasive, and technically sophisticated in their first languages, but sometimes struggled to express complex ideas in English. Gary learned to separate communication fluency from competence. He also adapted his own communication by slowing down, avoiding idioms, and simplifying sentence structure so language was not an unnecessary barrier to participation. Perhaps the most important principle that Gary learned was to approach every person and culture with curiosity and humility. No amount of reading or training could prepare him to be an expert on all cultures. The most productive stance was recognizing what he didn't know and being open to learning through interaction. When he made cultural missteps, he acknowledged them, apologized, and asked how to do it better. That combination of humility and curiosity helped build trust even when cultural intelligence was still developing. Gary's first major cross cultural conflict centered on time orientation. He came from a monochronic culture common in many Western contexts where time is compartmentalized and punctuality is treated as essential. Gary expected meetings to start on time, agendas to be followed in sequence, and discussions to be clearly time boxed. When conversations ran long or drifted off the agenda, he felt frustrated or inefficient. His partners in Mexico and several Middle Eastern countries operated very differently. These were polychronic cultures where time is more fluid and relationships take priority over schedules. Meetings began when key people arrived, not necessarily at the scheduled start time. Agendas functioned as general guides rather than strict plans. Conversations continued until relational and contextual issues were resolved, regardless of how long that took. Understanding differences in time orientation helped Gary reduce frustration and miscommunication. He learned to adapt his approach depending on cultural context. With monochronic partners, he maintained clear schedules and strict time management. With polychronic partners, he built in extra time for relationship development and accepted greater flexibility around agendas and start times. Gary also learned to communicate his own needs more explicitly. When working with polychronic partners, he explained that he was managing multiple commitments and asked whether certain business discussions could begin by a specific point in the meeting. That this was not about imposing his norms, but about negotiating expectations openly. Ultimately, Gary realized he couldn't and shouldn't try to force everyone to adopt his approach to time. Effective cross cultural communication required meeting partners where they were. Developing comfort with both monochronic and polychronic cultures became one of his strongest professional skills, allowing him to work more effectively across diverse cultural contexts. He also learned that the way people communicate at work is deeply shaped by whether they come from a more individualistic or collectivist culture. Gary grew up in an individualistic culture where independence, personal achievement, and individual rights were emphasized. Without really thinking about it, he focused on individual goals, individual performance reviews, and individual recognition. He expected people to speak up for their own ideas, advocate for their positions, and take credit for their personal contributions. Several members of Gary's team, however, came from collectivist cultures where interdependence and group harmony and collective well being are prioritized. These team members were often uncomfortable with being singled out for individual recognition. They preferred to attribute success to the group and were more likely to avoid direct disagreement in order to maintain harmony. Advancing the team mattered more to them than standing out as individuals. Gary learned that this cultural dimension affects far more than recognition. It shapes how decisions are made, how disagreements are expressed, and how accountability is understood. In individualistic cultures, decisions are often made by individuals who are clearly accountable for outcomes. In collectivist cultures, decisions tend to emerge through group discussion and shared responsibility. Although Canada leans toward individualism, Gary realized that he couldn't assume everyone working in Canada shared those values. Many of his team members retained collectivist orientations shaped by their cultures of origin. Inclusive communication meant creating a space for both approaches. Rather than treating individualism as the default, Gary learned to adapt his leadership style, balancing individual autonomy with collective collaboration, depending on what his team members needed to do with their best work. He learned that differences in hierarchy and power shape how communication works in very real ways. His Canadian background leans strongly toward egalitarianism. He was used to relatively flat hierarchies, casual communication with leaders, and the expectation that people at all levels could contribute ideas and challenge decisions. When he began to work with partners in India and several East Asian countries, those assumptions no longer held. Hierarchy mattered much more. Communicating directly with senior leaders without going through proper channels could be seen as disrespectful. Informal or overly casual communication that felt normal to Gary was inappropriate in more hierarchical contexts.
We had a project deadline that was clearly going to be missed. From my cultural lens, the obvious response was to dig in, work longer hours, pull in more people, and push hard to shrink the delay as much as possible. That's what being professional looked like to me. My partner saw it completely differently. Their response was basically, this timeline was unrealistic to begin with, so let's reset expectations instead of burning people out trying to hit something that was never achievable. To them, pushing harder wasn't commitment. It was creating stress for no real gain. At the time, we both thought the other one was being unprofessional. I thought they didn't care enough about excellence. They thought I was being unrealistic and reckless with people's time and energy. We were talking past each other without realizing it. Nothing moved forward until we actually stopped and named what was going on. We had to have a very explicit conversation about how our cultures define performance, responsibility, and timelines. Once that was on the table, we could find an approach that worked for both of us. Not perfect, but shared.
He came from a culture that strongly rewarded innovation, achievement, and pushing for excellence. In some of his partner cultures, stability, balance, and harmony were valued more than constantly raising performance expectations. This led to different assumptions about deadlines, acceptable levels of pressure, and how success should be recognized or celebrated. Future orientation added another layer of difference. Gary's organization invested heavily in long term planning, building technical architecture that might slow short term delivery but pay off later. Some of his partners were more present oriented, prioritizing immediate results over long term infrastructure. Neither approach was inherently right or wrong, but without explicit discussion, these differences created tension and misunderstanding. Over time, Gary learned that each of these cultural dimensions shaped expectations about work, communication, and decision making. Rather than assuming shared norms, he began naming these differences directly. He asked partners about how decisions were typically made, what timelines felt realistic, and how quality was defined. Making these expectations explicit reduced friction and allowed collaboration to move forward with much greater clarity and, most important, trust. Gary also learned that cultures differ in how much assertiveness and confrontation are considered appropriate. He came from a moderately assertive culture where being direct was valued, but usually balanced with relationship maintenance. In some contexts, that felt normal and professional. In others, it didn't land the same way. He worked with partners from highly assertive cultures where very blunt and even confrontational communication was expected, not considered rude at all. At the same time, he also worked with partners from much lower assertiveness cultures where his moderate directness came across as aggressive or disrespectful. The same communication style could signal confidence in one context and hostility in another. Gary also became aware of differences in humane orientation, which reflects how much a culture emphasizes compassion, fairness, and generosity versus personal gain. He saw this most clearly in how partners approached business relationships. Some emphasized mutual benefit, long term trust, and fairness as the foundation to collaboration. Others were more transactional, focused on maximizing advantage within legal and ethical boundaries. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but they created very different relationship dynamics and expectations about negotiation, compromise, and loyalty. Uncertainty avoidance added another layer Gary had to navigate. His own cultural background had relatively low uncertainty avoidance. He was comfortable with ambiguity, flexible plans, and adapting as projects evolved. Some of his partners weren't. They came from cultures with high uncertainty avoidance, where ambiguity created anxiety rather than opportunity. These partners needed detailed plans, clear procedures, defined roles, and minimized risk before they could commit. Gary learned that flexibility from him sometimes felt like chaos to others, and that providing structure was a form of inclusion rather than bureaucracy. Gender egalitarianism also shaped Gary's cross cultural work. He partnered with organizations from cultures with very different expectations around gender roles and leadership. In some contexts, women in senior or technical leadership roles were unusual, which created real communication challenges. Gary had to navigate situations where women on his team were treated differently than men might have been, while still holding firm to his commitment of gender equity. Respecting the cultural differences didn't mean compromising on core values. Understanding these dimensions helped Gary communicate more effectively without abandoning what mattered to him. Cultural intelligence didn't require him to accept inequity or disrespect. It required him to recognize where differences were negotiable and where values weren't. By doing so, he could adapt his communication, build trust across cultures, and still remain grounded in principles like fairness, dignity, and respect for all team members. Gary learned that trust isn't earned the same way in every culture. In his Canadian context, trust was built primarily through task competence. If you delivered high quality work on time, you were seen as reliable and professional. Personal relationships existed alongside work, but they were largely separate from professional trust. In other cultural contexts, that separation didn't exist. Several of Gary's partners in Latin America and Middle Eastern countries placed much greater emphasis on personal relationships and character when deciding whether someone could be trusted professionally. Before they could fully trust Gary's work, they wanted to get to know him as a person. They asked about his family, his background, and his values. This personal understanding was not informal or optional. It was the foundation of professional trust. Building trust across cultures required Gary to develop empathy for what mattered within the different cultural frameworks. Rather than assuming his own approach to trust was universal, he learned to adapt. When partners prioritized relationships, he invested time in the relationship building. When partners emphasized credentials, process, or formal structure, he focused on those elements instead. This was not about being inauthentic. It was about recognizing that trust rests on culturally specific foundations. Gary also returned to a principle he had first learned during the Mark situation, adopting a learner mindset. In cross cultural work, this mindset became even more important. He approached interactions assuming that his partners possessed valuable knowledge shaped by their experiences in cultural contexts. This posture of curiosity and respect made trust easier to build. People could sense that he genuinely valued their perspectives rather than merely tolerating difference. Over time, that learner mindset became one of Gary's most effective tools for building strong, durable relationships across cultures.
I made a trip to Brazil to meet with our partners for project planning. I showed up with everything ready. Detailed project docs, technical specs, timelines, the whole thing. In my head, we were going to sit down and work through the plans step by step. Instead, they took me to lunch, then dinner, then out for drinks. We talked about families, careers, life, all of it. Hardly a word about the project. I could feel myself getting more and more frustrated, thinking we were burning valuable time and getting nothing done. On the last day, we finally sat down to actually plan the project, and it went really smooth. Decisions were fast, alignment was easy, and there was almost no friction. My Brazilian partner explained it to my mate. They needed to know who I was as a person before they could really trust me to follow through on commitments. All that time I thought was wasted wasn't wasted at all. It was trust building. And once that trust was there, the work took care of itself.
Gary also had to learn that professional etiquette is deeply culture specific. Things as simple as meeting and greeting vary widely across cultures. In some places, physical contact like handshakes or even hugs is a normal and it's expected. In others, bowing or maintaining physical distance is appropriate. Titles and forms of address matter as well. Using the correct title can signal respect, while being too casual too quickly can signal disrespect. Gary learned to research greeting norms before meeting partners from unfamiliar cultures and, just as importantly, to watch closely and follow the lead of his hosts. He also discovered that acceptable conversation topics are not universal. Gary paid close attention to how people reacted and adjusted accordingly. In some cultures, asking about family was a sign of genuine interest and relationship building. In others, it crossed a personal boundary. Topics like politics, religion, or income, which might come up casually in his own cultural context, were completely inappropriate elsewhere. Learning what not to talk about turned out to be just as important as knowing what to talk about. Gary also connected to Gary also connected etiquette to time orientation. Punctuality, meeting flow, and scheduling reflected the monochronic and polychronic differences he had already encountered. Rather than insisting on his own expectations, he learned to adapt local norms and negotiate expectations when necessary. Shared meals became another important learning area. In many cultures, meals carry significant meaning beyond food. Gary learned to pay attention to dining norms such as utensil use, who ordered first, who pays, how to toast, and what signals to respect at the table. He also learned about proximity and personal space. What felt like a comfortable distance in Canada could feel uncomfortably close or surprisingly distant in other cultural contexts. Over time, Gary understood these details were not superficial politeness. They were signals of respect and cultural intelligence. Small etiquette missteps could quietly damage trust, while thoughtful attention to cultural norms could accelerate relationship building. For Gary, learning etiquette became another practical way to show that he valued his partners and took cross cultural collaboration seriously. As Gary's work became more global, much of his communication moved into virtual spaces, which added another layer of complexity to cross cultural interaction. He quickly learned that clarity mattered even more online. In multicultural settings, Gary made a conscious effort to speak more slowly, use simple and accessible language, and avoid idioms and colloquial expressions that didn't translate well across cultures. He stopped assuming his message was clear just because it made sense to him and instead checked for understanding regularly. Gary also became more intentional about how he presented himself on video. He made a point of dressing professionally for virtual meetings, even when working from home. This was not about formality for its own sake. It was a way of signaling respect for the interaction and for his partner's time. He learned that expectations around professional dress varied across cultures, with some contexts placing much higher value on formal appearance than others. Virtual communication also meant accepting technical realities. Time zone differences, unstable internet connections, platforming compatibilities, and occasional delays were part of the process. Gary learned to build buffer time into his meetings, to have backup communication channels ready, and to remain patient when technology disrupted carefully planned agendas. Frustration rarely helped, and flexibility was often required. More importantly, Gary learned that virtual communication did not reduce the need for cultural intelligence. All the principles he had learned about hierarchy, assertiveness, relationship building, and etiquette all still applied online. In some cases, they mattered even more. Virtual environments stripped away many nonverbal cues that helped smooth misunderstandings in face to face interaction. That made intentional, culturally respectful communication essential rather than optional.
I was on a video call with our partners in Japan at 8 in the morning my time, which meant it was late evening for them. Since it was so early for me, I was dressed pretty casually and didn't think much of it, which felt normal in my context. Then I noticed that everyone on their side was in full business attire, even though it was late at night for them. That's when it hit me that what felt relaxed and acceptable to me might come across as careless or even disrespectful to them. After that call, I changed how I handled international meetings. No matter what time it is for me, I dress professionally when I'm meeting with partners from other cultures. It's a small adjustment, but it's an easy way to show respect and signal that I take the relationship seriously.
After 2 years of rebuilding his team and intentionally developing his inclusion and cultural intelligence skills, Gary took time to reflect on what he had learned. He came to see that inclusive workplaces and effective global communication are deeply interconnected competencies. The skills required to build inclusion within diverse Canadian teams form the foundation for working successfully across cultures. Both required understanding difference, questioning assumptions, and adapting communication rather than relying on default habits. Gary also recognized that understanding diversity, both within cultures and across them, directly shaped leadership effectiveness. His experience with Mark had taught him that technical leadership without strong communication skills was simply not enough. Rebuilding his team showed him something else. Communication skills without cultural intelligence were also insufficient. Effective leadership in contemporary workplaces required all three dimensions working together: technical competence, communication ability, and cultural intelligence.
When I fired Mark, I thought the problem was just one difficult person. One bad fit, and what I learned over the next couple of years was that the problem was much bigger than Mark because the real issue was me. I had never built an inclusive team culture. I had tolerated diversity, but I hadn't actively created inclusion because I assumed good intentions were enough. The issue was I didn't really look at my own biases or blind spots, and I operated from my own cultural norms without asking whether those norms made it harder for others to succeed. Rebuilding the team after Mark gave me a chance to do it differently. I didn't get it right away, and I made plenty of mistakes. But instead of getting defensive, I tried to treat those mistakes as learning moments, and I started developing deliberate cultural intelligence through reading, uncomfortable conversations, trial and error, and being humble about how much I didn't know. The team I lead now is the strongest team I've ever had, not because every single person is the most technically brilliant option out there, even though they are all extremely skilled. It's strong because the culture is different. Diverse perspectives are actually valued, not just tolerated. People feel safe being themselves at work. Inclusion isn't assumed, it's practiced every day. If there's one thing I want you to take from all of this, it's this. Inclusion and cultural intelligence are not soft skills or nice extras, but core competencies. They determine whether you can lead effectively in diverse and global workplaces. You can learn them, but only if you're willing to look honestly at your own assumptions, challenge your instincts, and do the work to understand perspectives that aren't your own. The stakes are real. Without inclusion and cultural intelligence, you'll limit your own effectiveness, hurt your teams, and miss opportunities that only come from real collaboration across difference. With them, you can build teams that are stronger than the sum of their parts. Teams that innovate because of their differences, not in spite of them. Teams that can do things homogeneous groups simply can't. That's what I learned after Mark. And that's what I hope you learn before you have to learn it the hard way.
Gary's journey made clear that cultural intelligence develops through intentional learning and reflection. It's not quick and easy. It requires reading, training, difficult conversations, mistakes, apologies, and ongoing self examination. But the investment matters. His team performed better, his global partnerships became stronger, and his leadership capabilities grew in meaningful ways. In the end, Gary's learning came down to a set of guiding attitudes: approach every interaction with respect, curiosity, empathy, and humility. Respect means recognizing that equal worth of all people and cultures. Curiosity means wanting to understand difference rather than judging it. Empathy means trying to see situations from others' perspectives. Humility means accepting that your way of working is not the only way or the best way, but one culturally shaped approach among many. Together, these attitudes, combined with the skills explored throughout the session, form the foundation for inclusive workplaces and effective global communication. They're learnable competencies, and they will increasingly determine professional effectiveness in diverse and interconnected work environments.
After 2 years of rebuilding his team, Gary came to understand something fundamental about what had really happened with Mark. He spent a full year trying to fix Mark, convinced that he was the problem. Letting him go felt like the hard but necessary decision. But the rebuilding process forced Gary to see a more uncomfortable truth. The problem had not been only Mark, it had also been Gary. He created an environment where only certain people could thrive because it rewarded communication styles that mirrored his own and undervalued approaches that felt unfamiliar. He had treated his own cultural norms as neutral and universal, without recognizing that they were simply one way of working, not the only way. From this journey, Gary learned 2 critical lessons. Mark showed him that technical brilliance without communication skills can destroy teams. Rebuilding the team taught him something just as important, that communication skills without inclusion and cultural intelligence are equally limiting. The difference between the team that struggled under Mark and the team that thrived afterward was not just the removal of one toxic individual. It was the creation of a culture where differences strengthened the team instead of making some people feel uncomfortable or excluded. This is the lesson you need to carry into your professional lives. Diversity is no longer optional or exceptional in modern workplaces. It's a given. Inclusion, however, is a choice. You can work in diverse environments and still exclude people by refusing to adapt, by imposing your own norms, or by valuing only perspectives that look and sound like your own. Or you can choose inclusion by developing cultural intelligence, challenging your biases, and genuinely valuing what different perspectives contribute. That choice will shape not only the kind of teams you work on, but the kind of professional and leader you become.
Design, create, communicate. I want that.